right, why don't we go ahead and get started here? As I said, welcome to our September session for AI4C, Artificial Intelligence for Clinicians, lecture series that's presented by Mass General Brigham AI. And today we are fortunate to have Dr. James Hillis, who is from Mass General Brigham AI, to share artificial intelligence in the clinical environment with us. As you know, we have this series every second Thursday of the month, and we take the summer off. We go from September to May. I'm sorry, those dates are wrong there, but here's our lineup of 2025, the fall session. We have Dr. Hillis. Next month, we'll have Dr. Corey Arnold from UCLA, Mary Ellen Geiger from University of Chicago, and Tara Retson from UC San Diego. As you know, returning viewers can look at past recordings at that link there, and that link will be put in the chat. So you can go ahead and look at all the past recordings that we've had over the past number of years. And there are a lot of great talks there for you to review. Please do fill out the survey, give us feedback so we know how to improve the series. You can visit Mass General Brigham AI on a number of social media links and LinkedIn, Twitter, and our webpage as well. As I mentioned, today we have Dr. James Hillis as our guest speaker. Dr. Hillis completed his medical school at the University of Melbourne, and then he did a Doctor of Philosophy from the University of Oxford. He subsequently completed the Brigham and Women's Hospital and Mass General Hospital combined neurology residency program, and then he followed that up with an advanced general and autoimmune neurology fellowship at Mass General Hospital. Clinically, he works closely with, obviously, neurology, but other specialties as well, including rheumatology, infectious diseases, and oncology. Dr. Hillis came to the then called Mass General Brigham Center for Clinical Data Science, the Data Science Office, I believe as a resident, and he started doing research in artificial intelligence with us. He's currently the Director of Clinical Operations for our Digital Clinical Research Organization of the Mass General Brigham AI office, and he is an attending neurologist at Massachusetts General Hospital and an assistant professor of neurology at Harvard Medical School. His research focuses on validation studies of diagnostic artificial intelligence algorithms, and he's been involved in the studies to provide submissions to the Food and Drug Administration for over 15 successful submissions. This is a ton of work, believe me, and James has done this for 15 of these submissions. I've had the pleasure of working with James on a number of projects, and he's a delight. Today, he's going to share with us some of his experiences around artificial intelligence in the clinical environment. So I'm going to stop sharing, Dr. Hillis, and you will have the floor.
Whoops, I'm on mute. I'm now off mute. And I was just starting to say thank you so much, Kathy, for the very kind introduction and also for the invitation to speak here today. As you mentioned, my talk today will be on artificial intelligence in the clinical environment. And through my work with Mass General Brigham AI, I've been fortunate to have been exposed to many artificial intelligence algorithms, and for that matter, actually specifically many artificial intelligence, machine learning enabled medical devices that have ultimately received authorization through the FDA. And my hope is that today I can share many of the lessons and many of the insights that I have learned along the way. So here are my disclosures. The key disclosure that is relevant to this presentation is that I have received funding through Mass General Brigham AI for AI algorithm research, and that includes funding that has come from industry partners. They include Annalise, Riverain, and Viz, whose devices will be mentioned in this talk. And so for the broad outline of what I'll go through today, I'd like to start off by providing an overview of artificial intelligence concepts. I would then like to describe Mass General Brigham AI and specifically where the digital CRO, which is the group that I'm lucky enough to work with, where that fits in. And then I'll go through 10 key lessons that I have learned about artificial intelligence in the clinical environment. So with that, let me launch into an overview of artificial intelligence. And I'll start off with the definitions. And I suspect for many of you, you have been in a situation or you've encountered something online where something has claimed to use artificial intelligence. As you've looked further into it, though, you've actually realized that it's just using the same logic that computers have used for the past 30, 40 years, in particular, sort of if this, then that type logic. And you've sort of been left a little bit deflated thinking, hey, that's not really what I think of as artificial intelligence. And the truth is, there's no actual specific definition for artificial intelligence, which ultimately means that people are, to an extent, free to do what they want with the definition of artificial intelligence. In addition, there is also the fact that artificial intelligence is a buzz phrase that is frequently used. And as such, you will often see it applied to different situations where you may actually take a second look and say, hey, that doesn't quite seem like the AI that I'm thinking of. So here are a couple of definitions that do exist in the broader literature. First of all, what we don't know how to do yet. And secondly, to make computers do the sorts of things that minds do. Now, for many of you, when you think about artificial intelligence, you are actually potentially thinking more of artificial general intelligence. And that's a hypothetical computer program that can perform intellectual tasks as well as or better than a human. And for me, this is more of the sci-fi futuristic type of artificial intelligence that I think of when I hear the term AI. And the other part that factors into the definition here is the Turing test. And this was proposed by the British mathematician, the British codebreaker, Alan Turing, back in 1950, where a human interrogator interacts with a machine and human via written statements, yet is not able to distinguish between them. And of course, over recent years, large language models have successfully passed the Turing test, which has been a huge accomplishment for data science as a field. One of the key reasons that we've seen the growth in artificial intelligence over especially the past decade is the increase in computing power. And Gordon Moore was one of the co-founders of Intel. Back in the 1960s, he proposed that the number of transistors on microchips would double every year. He revised that prediction in the 1970s to doubling every 2 years. And this graph, which goes from 1970 up until 2020, shows how that prediction has actually stood that test of time. Into a few further definitions, here you can see a Venn diagram that shows that machine learning is a type of artificial intelligence, and then deep learning is a type of machine learning. I realize that there are some wordier definitions on the slides, but very briefly, machine learning is about pattern recognition, and deep learning is about using a neuron-inspired model for that pattern recognition. And so just to go into some further detail about some different types of machine learning, first of all, there is supervised learning, and this involves providing labels so that a computer can learn to identify those labels. The classic example here is that you give a computer images of cats, images of dogs, and these are labeled as cats and dogs. The computer then learns to tell the difference between cats and dogs, such that if you then give the computer a separate image that it has not seen before, it can tell you whether it contains a cat or a dog. And ultimately, the same is similar for many of the different machine learning models, algorithms, devices that are used in the medical world. They are trained by actually saying to a computer, here is a head CT that has an intracranial hemorrhage. Here is a head CT that does not have an intracranial hemorrhage, and actually giving that computer thousands, if not tens of thousands of different head CTs to learn what a hemorrhage is and what a hemorrhage isn't. And ultimately, those computers go away and they learn to differentiate between those head CTs such that they can identify an intracranial hemorrhage on a head CT. Unsupervised learning, on the other hand, involves allowing a computer to infer relationships without labels. The example that I like to use here is something that I think all of us encounter on a daily basis, which is predictive advertising online. And so for e-commerce websites, ultimately what they're wanting to do is they're wanting to sell you a product. And what they will do is they will look at products that you have looked at and then products that you have ultimately purchased and attempt to learn the relationships between them. And of course, they're doing this across thousands, if not millions of people who are looking at their websites. And ultimately, if they see that, hey, you started off by looking at item A and ultimately purchased item B, they'll be thinking, okay, if somebody else is looking at item A, maybe we should suggest that they look at item B as well, because that's what they'll ultimately purchase. And the key thing here, unlike the supervised learning, is that ultimately it's not a case that sort of item A has been labeled as being something that somebody will browse and item B is something that's been labeled as something that somebody will purchase, but rather these relationships are things that the computer models in the background are looking at and determining what should actually be shown to people online as part of that advertising. Then there is reinforcement learning. This is more of a Pavlovian style of learning where a computer receives and incorporates feedback. I'll say beyond these three learning styles or learning methods that are written here, there are also other types of learning. For example, there is something that is called semi-supervised learning. This is a hybrid model between supervised learning and unsupervised learning. There is also something called self-supervised learning, and this is where a model actually generates the labels that it is using itself. I'll say with semi-supervised and self-supervised learning, it is in a large part because of these types of learning that large language models have been able to come into being. And that's because ultimately you can have artificial intelligence models that are able to go ahead and use vast amounts of data without requiring it to be manually annotated such that there are labels that it can learn from. And to go through deep learning briefly, as I mentioned, this is something that's inspired by neurons. And so ultimately deep learning involves artificial neural networks, and it's a network that goes from input to hidden to output layers, which is inspired by neurons and synapses. And so if I actually use the same example that I used before about having a head CT and trying to determine if there's an intracranial hemorrhage, the input layer here involves the pixels, or specifically actually the voxels within that head CT. The output layer involves saying whether or not an intracranial hemorrhage is present or absent. And what happens is that there are links from each of these voxels to the first of the hidden layers, and each of these links will have a different weight that is assigned to them, similar to having different strengths of synapses between neurons in the brain. And ultimately that first hidden layer may go to a second, third, and so on, multiple other hidden layers, and it will ultimately produce the output, which is presence or absence of intracranial hemorrhage. And what happens with an artificial neural network is it's trained thousands of times on thousands of head CTs, and it's something where the output is compared, at least in the case of a supervised model, it is compared to the expected output. And then there's a mathematical process known as backwards propagation, also linked in with something called forwards propagation, that allows the strengths of all of these different links between the layers to be adjusted such that you develop a more and more accurate model, and hopefully ultimately end up with a model that is very accurate at identifying an intracranial hemorrhage on a head CT. And so final slide here, just as far as an introduction to artificial intelligence. I think all of us appreciate just how much more AI features on a daily basis. I'll actually say I've had two separate people this week tell me that they receive recipes from ChatGPT. Actually, one of them, who as part of their prompt even entered into ChatGPT, I'm planning on doing a shop on this day, and so can you plan my meals such that I use more of the perishables earlier in the week and have longer lasting items as part of my ingredients later in the week. And it's yet another example of how AI is becoming omnipresent in the world today. But here you can see the cumulative number of AI ML enabled medical devices that have been authorized by the FDA. What you can see here as well is that the vast majority are radiology devices that have gone through the FDA, followed by cardiovascular, then neurology, and then all of the other areas as well. So with that being said, let me provide a brief introduction to Mass General Brigham AI. And I will actually say I have asked ChatGPT for a little bit of assistance with this. I'll actually say it's a slightly older version of ChatGPT that features in this slide now. I realize that it's now ChatGPT 5 that provides answers. But I said to ChatGPT, can you please create an image showing the interaction between Massachusetts General Hospital and artificial intelligence? And over the space of 30 seconds or so, this is what it came back with. Two quick notes before I go further on this slide. I'll say, first of all, out of principle, I always say please to ChatGPT. I realize that it's a computer at the end of the day, or a collection of computers, but I was taught to always say please, so I continue to say please to ChatGPT. The second item that I will say is I actually find that one of the most pragmatic uses for me for ChatGPT is putting together slides, putting together images. And if I wanted an image for a slide, it would often be a case of searching the web for half an hour to find an appropriate image for a slide, and you'd finally find one. These days, it's a case of sort of typing it into ChatGPT. If you don't like it, you can simply say to ChatGPT, hey, do you mind altering this? I was recently at a meeting for the American Academy of Neurology where the social event involved us going lawn bowling. And I actually said to ChatGPT, hey, can you please create an image of neurologists going lawn bowling, which it promptly obliged and provided a great image. It was actually sort of essentially a photo of 4 or 5 neurologists lawn bowling in white coats. And then I said to ChatGPT, could you please create a cartoon of this image? And within 30 seconds, it had provided a Simpsons-esque cartoon of exactly the same image. And it was incredible how easy it was to generate that with ChatGPT. So that being said, and I will actually just digress a little bit more here to say one of the issues with large language models, as many of you know, is hallucinations. And that is where a large language model comes back to you very confidently saying something that ultimately is not correct. And ultimately, it's a safety issue that still needs to be worked through with large language models. Here, I will say with the image, the key thing that stood out to me was actually just the size of the people standing outside this hospital, where you'll see there are evidently these giants who are, first of all, twice the size of some of the people who they're walking around, but they're actually taller than any of the floors within the hospital. I will say that the flip side here is that hallucinations actually allow out-of-the-box thinking and the opportunity to create new ideas and think about things in different ways, which has its own plus, its own positive. The flip side is if you're asking ChatGPT a very specific question, for example, about a medication, you want it to come back with accurate information that you know that you can trust. So to launch into Mass General Brigham AI, I will actually say Kathy was one of my interviewers as part of my first interview when I came to the team. Ultimately, I started there in April, I think it was, of 2018, but I'd interviewed with Kathy in January or February of 2018. And more broadly speaking, for Mass General Brigham AI, that actually started off as the Center for Clinical Data Science, then became the Data Science Office. It came about because a lot of different companies were approaching Mass General or Massachusetts General Hospital and Brigham and Women's Hospital in the mid-2010s to say, hey, we're aware of AI, we're aware of the importance of data. We want to purchase your data so that we can train different machine learning algorithms and models. And MGH and Brigham turned around and said, that's great. Our data are not for sale. However, we're happy to partner with you and develop AI algorithms that ultimately we can think about taking out into the clinical environment. And one of the initial main relationships that came into being was with GE Healthcare, where ultimately the Center for Clinical Data Science team was working to develop a number of different algorithms for GE Healthcare, where at the end of the day it was a team at the Center for Clinical Data Science that involved data scientists, involved clinicians, involved people who were able to take care of the broader business side of things, working together with people from GE to develop these different models. And so I started off with my involvement being involved in the development of different stroke algorithms. And then in the middle of 2020, we had fortunately actually reached a stage where many of these models had reached fruition, and we were then thinking of, okay, how do we deploy them more broadly? And for that, how do we actually get through the FDA with these algorithms? And at that stage, we set up a separate group called the Digital Clinical Research Organization, or the Digital CRO, within what at that stage was the Data Science Office. And it's the Digital CRO that I've worked almost exclusively with since that point in time. I'll say that there are a lot of links between the different teams within Mass General Brigham AI, but in terms of the validation and regulatory clearance or regulatory authorization of different devices, that's where my focus has been since the middle of 2020. Conveniently, that also happened to line up with when I had finished my fellowship in the middle of 2020 and was becoming an attending. And so at that stage, I was able to take on this role with Mass General Brigham AI alongside seeing patients, which I continue to do. And so just to go through this diagram in a little bit more detail, which ultimately this diagram reflects the many different areas that we look after within Mass General Brigham AI. Initially, there's a question of product design and market fit for an AI algorithm. Then there's the data curation and the labeling that takes place. There's the AI product development. Then if it's going out ultimately to be a product or a device that goes to market, you need to think about validation and regulatory clearance or regulatory authorization. And then as part of the buzzword that's used here is the total product lifecycle, you also want to think about deployment and clinical integration, real world monitoring, model refinement, and then ultimately that comes back to actually retraining models and thinking about taking them through the process again. And so a couple of the key groups within Mass General Brigham AI include the product development team that very much thinks about product development, and then the Digital Clinical Research Organization that very much thinks about how do we validate and take models through regulatory clearance. I'll say with all of this, we also have a quality management system that allows us to record everything and ensure that we're in line with the relevant parts of different ISO certifications. And ultimately, that's something that's important, especially for devices that ultimately enter the market as regulated devices. And so just a few further details about the Digital CRO. It was created in 2020. We have worked with over 12 companies for both regulatory and non-regulatory purposes. These projects have encompassed approximately 50 findings and 6 different modalities: X-ray, CT, MRI, point-of-care ultrasound, ECG, and vital sign data. And ultimately, our projects have been used as the basis for 17 successful device submissions to the US Food and Drug Administration. In addition to those 17, we've got another 2 or 3 devices that are in front of the FDA at the moment. And actually, I think at least one more study that has been completed and will shortly go to the FDA. So fortunately, we see that number continuing to grow. And it's been something that's been very exciting to be part of. So to jump to the key part of my talk, which is about the lessons that I've learned along the way about AI implementation. And the area that I'll actually start off with is about AI ML enabled medical devices. And lesson number one here is that medical devices are regulated to ensure safe and effective use, although not all artificial intelligence and machine learning products are medical devices. I'll say part of the reason that I've included this is I'll often hear from people a comment along the lines of, hey, I've seen this particular thing that's doing this, but it hasn't gone through the FDA. And the truth is there are actually a lot of situations where, and I'm not going to call them devices, but products don't necessarily need to go through the FDA. And so ultimately, the US Food and Drug Administration administers regulations that are encapsulated within US law. And I'll actually say, following on from this, the US law actually specifies what functions constitute a device. And so if you've got a product, the initial distinction for a product is whether its functions constitute a device, which is defined in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And I'll actually say, and Kathy actually edited a book chapter that Greg Romina, who is the Director of Regulatory Affairs, I think is his specific title, but he's a director at Viz AI and has led the regulatory strategy for Viz over many, many years. He and I wrote a chapter for something called the Radiology AI Handbook. And I'll say that there are a lot of further details about the regulatory approach that are included within this chapter, including this particular item or box that you see here, which is taken straight from the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And here specifically, you can see this is the definition of a device. And according to number B, or letter B, a device is something that's intended for use in the diagnosis of disease or other conditions, or in the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease in man or other animals. Very briefly, to save you reading through, I'll just indicate that letter A indicates essentially to pharmaceutical products, and then letter C, as it states at the start, applies to devices that are intended to affect the structure or any function of the body. Before I move to the next slide, I'll also say that the FDA typically refers to AI/ML-enabled medical devices, and that's the current phrase that they use. I know in the past, software as a medical device, or SAMD, has been something that's been commonly used, but typically the phrasing that they'll use now when you look at their website is AI/ML-enabled medical devices. And following on from actually having this definition of a device, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act also defines software that is excluded from the definition of a device. And just to read through the first point here, as an example, something that displays, analyzes, or prints medical information about a patient or other medical information, such as peer-reviewed clinical studies and clinical practice guidelines. Actually, let me just go through the next one as well. I'll say ultimately this is an and statement for the three different components of this box, but supporting or providing recommendations to a healthcare professional about prevention, diagnosis, or treatment of a disease or condition. I won't read through the third one, but you can see that the broad theme here is essentially if you've got something that is actually diagnosing a situation or diagnosing a condition, that is something that would be considered a device. But on the other hand, something that's displaying information, printing medical information that ultimately enables somebody else to make that medical device, that diagnosis, means that that is not necessarily going to be a medical device. And I think one of the big examples that people have been speaking about recently is ambulatory dictation, where you've got a software system that is listening in as you have a clinic appointment. Ultimately, ambulatory dictation is not something that is providing a diagnosis. It is listening into the appointment. It is then transcribing what it has heard as part of the appointment and putting that into a clinic note, which I will say is then something to be reviewed by clinicians. And so the clinician is actually the person signing off on it. And so this is actually an example of something that would not be considered a device per the FDA. And therefore, for people who are asking the question of, is this software FDA authorized? Is it FDA cleared? The answer is no, and the answer is no because it does not need to go through the FDA. I will say that there is somewhat of a gray line here, and as you can imagine in this situation, and it goes beyond the scope of the talk today, but there is a gray line that exists here, and there is a lot of debate with some particular products of whether they constitute being a device or not a device. I'm happy to have that discussion with anybody at another time. I'll also add that you can actually end up with devices that actually have both what are considered device functions and also non-device functions, as in sort of many things that are ultimately considered device. They'll need supporting software that will not actually be considered a device function, but ultimately when you've got something that is a device, a medical device function, that would take precedence, and it would need to go through the FDA. So following on from that, lesson number 2 is that most of the current AI/ML enabled medical devices, especially those for radiology, are Class 2 devices. And the typical review processes for Class 2 devices involves involve the de novo and 510K pathways. So here you can see a table that lists out the 3 different classes of devices. The broad risk levels that are assigned to them are low, moderate, and high. You can then see the review processes. I'll actually jump across to the right column now to give you the examples, which a Class 1 device is something that ultimately doesn't need to go through the FDA. Something along these lines would be something like a bandage. Class 2 is where most of the radiology AI software fits in, and then Class 3 is where you have implantable devices. I'll say from a regulatory language perspective, and this is actually specifically the FDA regulatory language, they actually use different terms and verbs specifically for when something goes through the FDA. And you'll actually see here that the term cleared is something that is used for 510K submissions and devices that go down that pathway. For something that is a de novo device, that uses the terminology of granted. For something that goes through a PMA, a pre-market approval, that uses the term approved. And if you've got an exempt device, that is ultimately referred to as an exempt device. I will say for the purposes of this talk, I'll say that while this table is sort of black and white in the sense that it breaks everything out into the different rows, unfortunately, the regulatory landscape is not as black and white, and there can be review processes that extend over other classes. And I realize that it says specifically there that sort of otherwise the same as Class 2 under Class 1, as in you can have de novo and 510K pathways there. And there is other cross-pollination that can occur across this table. But broadly speaking, Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3 match up with those particular review processes. And so just to describe the de novo pathway and the 510K pathways in a little bit more detail, the de novo pathway is used to establish a new regulation together with the special controls that are used for a particular type of Class 2 device. And I'll provide some examples shortly of what some of these regulations are. But then a 510K or the 510K pathway involves demonstrating substantial equivalence to an existing device, and the buzzword here is a predicate device, and ultimately you comply with the established special controls for that type of a Class 2 device. I'll explain more about triage devices on the next or on one of the next slides, but Viz, which is a company, they had a device that detected large vessel occlusions. It was the de novo device for triage devices. It came through, it was the end of 2017 or start of 2018. There have been, I will say, at least 80, but it could actually be a number well over 100 that have come, devices that have come through the 510K pathway following on from that VIS device. And so they are all triage devices. I'll say they haven't necessarily all used VIS as the predicate device, because you can actually, VIS was the initial predicate that would have been used by the sort of second device, or the first device that came through on the 510K pathway, but it's possible to use one of the other devices that has come through as a 510K device as a predicate device. You don't need to use the de novo device. But essentially, VIS was the first of over 80 devices that have now come through as triage devices. So as I alluded to, Greg and I had written a book chapter that features as part of a broader book that Kathy and I were lucky enough to be two of the editors for, which is the Radiology AI Handbook. We actually received an email last week that indicated it was off to the printers, which we were very excited to see. And I think the specific publication date is December. I honestly actually don't know the specific timeline between now and then, but hearing that it's off to the printers, hopefully it may even be available before then. But please keep your eyes out for this handbook that will be published later this year. So lesson number 3 is the FDA process, especially the 510K pathway, has led to lanes for device types. And this is because of the special controls that I alluded to, where when you've got a device, it's got special controls that are listed out that ultimately any device that goes through under that particular regulation number needs to follow. And from a broader regulatory perspective, these device types allow consideration of the benefit and risk of devices, often with incremental increases for new device types, especially for risk. So just to go through some of the different device types, first of all, there is computer-aided detection. This is where you are detecting a finding on imaging. For example, you may be detecting a lung nodule on a CT scan. You may be detecting a lesion on mammography. Diagnosis is where you go a step beyond the detection and you're actually inferring something beyond what you can tell with the radiology study. And so, for example, you may be saying whether or not that particular lung nodule or that particular breast lesion is malignant versus benign. And so in the case of the breast lesion, it's something that ultimately you would ground truth back to the actual pathology rather than necessarily just the mammography and the radiology. And so from that perspective, it's going beyond what you can actually see just as part of the radiology study that is seen. And then to jump to the triage devices, which is what I had mentioned earlier, this involves the notification of potentially time-sensitive findings. There are a number of different use cases that ultimately stem from triage devices, and I'll actually go through a couple of them in more detail later. But at a broad level, one of the key things to do is actually prioritize the work list for radiologists. And so let's say a radiologist has 100 studies to work through. The abnormal one, the one with the intracranial hemorrhage, is number 99 on that list. As a radiologist and ultimately as a clinical team, it helps to identify that study on the sooner side. And so what these computer-aided triage and notification devices do is they will actually flag that study for earlier interpretation. So it's not going to be interpreted as study number 99, but hopefully as study number 1 and enable the next steps in that patient's care. What I will say is, in terms of the incremental risk with these types of devices, the item that comes up here is that at the end of the day, what a triage device is telling a radiologist is interpret this study next. And that radiologist ultimately still needs to interpret that study. And so in terms of the incremental risk, it's not that that device is actually replacing that radiologist's interpretation of that study. What it's doing is it's altering the prioritization of that study in terms of when the radiologist interprets it. And that's an example of the incremental increase in the risk that the FDA has allowed through a number of these different device types. I'll say in part following on from that regulatory approach, but in part because sort of you need to chip away at things to ultimately achieve a bigger picture. One of the key lessons that I've learned, and it applies for radiology AI implementation, but I'll say it applies for medical AI implementation, is that implementation will occur via incremental steps. And so here are proposed steps where AI can help the radiology workflow. You'll see you've got a clinician who puts in an image request that leads to acquisition data, DICOM images. You then have a radiologist who provides a radiology report. They then provide or that incorporates a diagnosis, and ultimately there are health outcomes. And you can see here in the darker text a number of the different opportunities for AI to help out with along the way. Two that I'll actually bring to your attention is quality assurance, which is next to the acquisition data. Quality assurance is something where if you can actually check a study at the time of its acquisition and check that it was acquired with sufficient quality, there's not too much motion artifact, etc. That's something that can then save a patient from needing to be called back for a repeat scan. And for that matter, you can actually use the AI as well for the image enhancement to hopefully reduce a lot of the motion artifact that becomes present. And these are examples of the incremental steps that will ultimately lead to the implementation of AI. Just to jump back to the FDA quickly and the regulation of devices, I see Kathy smiling, but ultimately she and I were lucky enough to work on this particular paper as well, which ultimately one of the key messages that came up here and we conveyed in this, I think it was technically entitled a commentary, but it was an opinion type article that was published in NPJ Digital Medicine last year, is that FDA lanes can lead to manufacturers curtailing innovative features that extend beyond a predicate device. And so here are the outputs from the same pleural effusion detection algorithm as a CE marked device in the European Union and as a US FDA cleared triage device. And so at the back end, it is exactly the same AI algorithm that is performing inference on the cases. But at the front end, in terms of what's actually displayed to radiologists and other clinicians, it is quite different. Here you can see that there is a heat map that shows where the pleural effusion is. There's actually a percentage here that is given for the likelihood or the probability of that pleural effusion being present. This is what is available in the European Union. In the US, and with something that's come through the FDA, as I said, the key thing is to identify the studies that need to be interpreted next. And so literally all you get is a pink dot that says, this is a case that is concerning for pleural effusion, interpret this one next. The blue dots here are for pneumothorax, in case you're wondering. And so you can see that because this has come through as a triage device, ultimately the FDA sees the incremental risk being, okay, this is going to allow the prioritization of cases, but it's not actually going to be allowed to influence the interpretation of the cases. It's something where the innovation has not necessarily gone as far as it could. And I'll say at a personal level, I find this challenging because I ultimately think it's something where it's incredibly important for the FDA to have the introduction of these incremental risks. The flip side is there's actually a strong clinical argument for why it helps to have the heat map, and that's actually when the AI algorithm is identifying something that you don't think is there and you're questioning why is it flagging this, and it's what we would describe as a false positive interpretation. And you don't actually have the explainability as a result of not having that heat map to actually look at these studies and say, okay, this is what it identified. Okay, yes, that is not actually a pleural effusion. I don't need to call it positive. I've reconciled that. Let me move on. And so that's something where I'll say I feel that it does limit the opportunity for what can be provided clinically. The flip side here, and I do want to emphasize, the FDA still provides plenty of opportunity to innovate. And here is a de novo device that was granted a de novo request by the FDA last year. It actually established a new regulation for devices that predict Alzheimer's disease. And specifically, this device, which is the BrainC device, provides a similarity score to predict amnestic mild cognitive impairment progressing to clinical AD dementia within 5 years. I'll say from my end, there are a number of components to this particular device receiving its de novo request, or rather being granted its de novo request that were of interest. The first is it's actually a multimodal device. It incorporates MRI, it incorporates demographic information such as age and sex. It also incorporates cognitive assessment scores. The second item is it's a prognostic device. And in terms of actually having insight into what an AI algorithm is providing as far as its information and being able to verify that, if you've got an algorithm that is identifying a pleural effusion, you can quickly verify that yourself by looking at the chest X-ray and saying the pleural effusion is present or absent. Yes, I agree, or no, I don't agree. But for something that is predicting the progression to Alzheimer's disease within the next 5 years, ultimately you need to wait 5 years potentially to see whether or not this device has actually been accurate. And so it brings up the subject of how much do you trust the black box of AI, and that's something that we collectively as a medical community will need to think about over the years to come. One of the other components that came up with this particular device, and this is something that we're seeing more and more with the FDA, is that they're placing a focus on post-market testing. And so for a lot of the devices that have gone through the FDA so far, a lot of them have been based on retrospective testing that is all done prior to that device being authorized by the FDA. Now we're seeing a much greater trend for the FDA wanting to continue to monitor how these devices operate in the real world, how accurate they are, which, coming back to the term that I used before of the total product life cycle, is very much being mindful of the total product life cycle. It's looking for the possibility of drift that may occur once it's out in the real world. And so that's a big trend that we're seeing as far as the FDA focusing a lot more on the post-market testing. I will say, for those of you who are interested in reading further about this particular device, I was lucky enough to join up with Eddie and Kirsten to write this particular viewpoint in JAMA Neurology about AI devices in neurology moving from diagnosis to prognosis. So lesson number 7 is that AI opens the door for opportunistic screening and disease identification that may otherwise not occur. And this opportunistic screening can occur on studies that are being ordered for different indications. And this opportunistic screening may also occur on cheaper and more accessible studies than those that are typically used for diagnosis. And so here, as far as the image that you see on the right here, there was a great perspective that was written by Eric Topol in The Lancet last year about AI-enabled opportunistic medical scan interpretation. And it came with this example of, you have this chest X-ray that ultimately indicates that it's not just used as a chest X-ray to identify, say, pneumonia, but it ultimately indicates that you may have type 2 diabetes. It gives you your coronary calcium score, which is 976. Your ejection fraction, the cardiac measurement, is normal. And your 10-year cardiovascular risk of a heart attack, stroke, or death from cardiovascular disease is 14.1%. Please review with your physician regarding potential addition or intensification of a statin to your medications. And this is an example of, okay, yes, you can get so much more information out of these studies that are already occurring. And we've actually had a couple of devices along these specific lines that we've worked on. The first here is an Annalise device. It is to do with vertebral compression fractures, and this was published earlier this year in the Journal of the American College of Radiology, with this study being led by Ankita Gadak. And it was about the potential clinical utility of an artificial intelligence model for identification of vertebral compression fractures in chest radiographs. And so this was, in terms of the study that we conducted, it was a standalone model performance assessment with 596 chest X-ray cases. And ultimately, the device here was looking for the presence of vertebral compression fractures. The device provided an output between 0 and 1, essentially indicating its confidence of there being a vertebral compression fracture. In this particular case, with an output of 0.97 being closer to 1, it was fairly confident that the vertebral compression fracture was there. And I'll say, even as a neurologist, I can identify the vertebral compression fracture that is present in this particular study. And ultimately, this device achieved an area under the curve of 0.955. And this particular operating point had a sensitivity and specificity of roughly 89% for each of them. We took this one step further, which was to actually look at the patients whose chest X-rays had been included. And we actually looked back at these patients' diagnostic codes in the chart, actually from quite a long period of time. I think it was at least a year after any of the chest X-rays had been obtained, but the actual study time period had been for something like 6 or 7 years initially. And so we were looking at this essentially 8-year range of ICD-10 codes that were present in a patient's chart. And these are the cases that were the true positives. So these were the cases that had a vertebral compression fracture that the model correctly identified were there. And you can see that actually only 36% of patients had a diagnosis of vertebral compression fracture in their chart. And of course, a concern if somebody's got a vertebral compression fracture is, do they have an underlying diagnosis of osteoporosis or osteopenia, being conditions that involve the bones becoming more fragile? And here you can see 52% had a diagnosis of osteoporosis, 28% had an diagnosis of osteopenia, and only 59% had either of them as a diagnosis. And following on from this, first of all, it's clear that there is an opportunity for care for these patients that is otherwise being missed at the moment in terms of identifying a process that is going on and then actually treating that process that's going on. And secondly, I'll actually say at a broader level, there are other examples of how this could be helpful. One is actually from a billing perspective. A lot of billing for patients, for hospitals, and ultimately allocation of healthcare resources comes down to the different diagnoses that patients have and the complexity of their medical situation. And if you're actually able to capture that these patients have these other diagnoses present, it means that these patients can be assigned more money because they're in a more complex situation, and that payers can essentially assign more money for their medical care. And without going into too much detail about the insurance side of things, there's actually a huge missed opportunity here. And I'll say, with the perspective that these could hypothetically run even on every chest X-ray that is done, they can actually help with health equity from that perspective as well, because inevitably there are going to be a lot of ICD-10 codes that are missed out on, and often these ICD-10 codes are actually missed most in settings where there are fewer resources. So there's a huge opportunity here for many different parts of the health system. Now, I'll also say, from the perspective that osteoporosis, osteopenia are very much preventative conditions, you can see here that we actually did a similar analysis with medications, and many of these patients were not on the medications that somebody should ideally be taking should they have osteoporosis or osteopenia. I'm mindful of time, so I'll keep working through the. While we're still on the opportunistic side of things, another device that we had worked on, and this was ultimately a de novo device as the first cardiovascular triage device, was for the VIS HCM device. This was a device that was working on ECGs to identify hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And we were able to show that this device can accurately identify hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. I'll say traditionally hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is not diagnosed, and for that matter, even now it's not diagnosed on ECG. There are features on ECG, including left ventricular hypertrophy, which is where you see enlargement of the left side of the heart. But ultimately, typically HCM is identified more through echocardiography and then actually even genetic testing. So one of the things that I found, and I'm going to skip to the sort of key points here, but I found fascinating about this device is in terms of identifying patients, it was actually incredibly good at identifying patients who had hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and not just patients who had left ventricular hypertrophy. And so on ECG, one of the key findings that you'll see for HCM, but ultimately the finding that's associated with left ventricular hypertrophy, is an increase in the amplitude of a number of the different leads. And you can see here in this negative case that actually for many of the leads, the amplitude of the ECG waveform is actually larger than what you see up here for the positive HCM case. And so the device was able to accurately discriminate against these cases and say, okay, yes, this one is somebody who has HCM versus this one is, and not that the device was identifying LVH, but the device was able to say this is somebody who does not have HCM. And then in looking at the case, and this actually happened before the device had gone through it, the cardiologists who were involved in this study had been able to look at this case and say, well, it does have LVH. And so the device was very accurate in discriminating there. So let me just bring up these boxes. As you can see, the device overall here had an area under the curve of 0.975. One of the comments that comes up frequently here is you've got a sensitivity of 68.4% and a specificity of 99.1%. I'll actually say this was done very much, and ultimately the operating points have been chosen prior to our analysis of this device, but the decision to favor specificity was done with the thought that this was a less prevalent condition. And if you drop the specificity too much, far too many of the cases that ultimately end up being positive will be false positive cases. And so the reason that specificity is ultimately favored over sensitivity here is to ultimately improve the positive predictive value such that it's not a case that for every 100 studies that you do, hypothetically, only one of them ends up being positive. And so here, the positive predictive value was 13.7%, and it's something where at the end of the day, that's better than having a positive predictive value of 1% for identifying HCM. I will say that there is now real-world evidence that has also been generated by others for this same algorithm. And so here you can see this was an assessment that Melinda Desai and team had done where they looked at 103,000 ECGs from almost 46,000 patients. 2.7% of them were flagged for HCM. Actually, almost half of them were patients who had known HCM. But then 5% of them reflected new HCM diagnoses. And I'll actually say based on these stats, you can see that the positive predictive value for this cohort would have actually have been 45%, which is higher than the 13% from our study. And so you can see that this algorithm, this device is very much having a real world clinical impact where it is identifying these patients who have a new diagnosis that can then be worked up and then patients can be treated with the appropriate treatments for HCM. Kathy, I will say I'm mindful we've reached 1 o'clock. I don't have far to go if you're happy for me to continue on. I realize people may need to drop, but I'll just keep going through. One point following on from all of this is that medicine will involve a much greater degree of quantification. And this quantification will require the translation of these numbers for patients, especially given that many decisions in medicine are still binary, as in, will you take a medication or not? That is a binary question at the end of the day. But let's say, for example, with the BrainC device that I mentioned earlier, if that's giving you a score, as it does, between 0 and 100 for your they call it a similarity score, but it's ultimately a score that sort of suggests, okay, will you end up with Alzheimer's disease? What does it mean if you end up with a score of 70, a score of 60, a score of 50, a score of 40, a score of 30? I will say in the case of BrainC, I think that's still very much something that is being evaluated to see exactly what those scores will mean. But actually translating those scores for patients will be something that becomes more and more important as time goes forward, because ultimately, as I said, many of the decisions in medicine are still binary, and it will be important to guide patients through those decisions. Yeah. Here is actually another analysis of an artificial intelligence model that we conducted, which was for opportunistic calculation of a Gadsden score on non-gated computed tomography of the chest. And so at the moment, a lot of the quantification to do with coronary artery calcium is based on a Gadsden categories of 0, 1 to 99, 100 to 399, and greater than or equal to 400, which allow cardiovascular risk assessments based on coronary artery calcium on chest CT. What we did is we evaluated this model, this device. It's now been cleared by the FDA on 491 CT cases. This is the Riverane CAC device. And it's something where it had a kappa for identifying the category of a Gadsden score of 0.959 and a Spearman correlation for the actual score of sort of 0, 262, et cetera, of 0.975. And so it was incredibly helpful and accurate at determining the coronary artery calcium. Beyond that, a Gadsden scores are traditionally calculated on cardiac gated chest CT, while this study used non-gated chest CT. And this study had 331 cases with a paired cardiac gated chest CT, so sort of the gold standard here. And we actually found that the kappa and the Spearman correlation were both above 0.9 when comparing back to the paired cardiac gated CT. And overall, the takeaway from this particular device is twofold. One is that it's actually another example of opportunistic screening. It is something where if you're having a chest CT that is being performed for another reason, say pneumonia, a chest infection, etc., you can also actually obtain the calcium artery score, the coronary artery calcium quantification, or the Gadsden score, essentially. But secondly, it's actually providing something that's much richer as far as the data from these particular cases. And traditionally, with these Gadsden scores that have been broadly broken up into these 4 different categories, when you're actually looking at these data at a bigger picture level and you're able to calculate these scores much more specifically and not just in the 4 big categories, there is the ability of actually providing much better risk stratification for patients who are here, and actually figuring out for patients who are in the, say, 100 to 399 group, if they're at 101, they may have a different risk to somebody who's at 398. And if you then involve that with the patient's age, their kidney function, et cetera, you can determine sort of whether or not this person should take aspirin or they shouldn't take aspirin. And that's ultimately where a lot of this quantification will come in. So 2 final lessons. One is that we will need to carefully think about how much autonomy AI systems have. And actually, I apologize, I don't know what's happened with this slide with the different components coming up, but the term meaningful human involvement provides an approach to consider human control and scalability. And while the maintenance of human control favors a human in the loop, there are scenarios where the clinical risk assessment favors a human on the loop. And what I mean by this is essentially it's always easier to remain in control when you're very much controlling the next step, saying yes or no to what will happen. But there are situations, especially situations where timeliness is important, where allowing that clinical process to move on is incredibly important from a risk perspective. And so Here's a table. Ken Payne, who I was lucky enough to write this article with, he is a professor of strategy who ultimately focuses on AI and warfare. And they have, as you can imagine, in the military, very much considered human in the loop, human on the loop, human on many loops. We thought through these three different situations for healthcare, where do you need to have a human user who confirms a model output and the proposed action prior to proceeding? Or do you have a human user who monitors that loop, intervenes when needed for human on the loop, or they monitor multiple loops? That is something where this provides different consideration for how much autonomy the AI systems can potentially have. Of course, with scalability, a human in the loop or a human on the loop are limited by one-to-one human involvement, but a human on many loops is not limited by that one-to-one involvement. With the timeliness, having a human on the loop as opposed to in the loop means that you're not limited by having a human confirm the proposed actions and the ability to move forward. And if you do actually have a human who needs to confirm something, they need the explainability of what's going on. As in, you need that human to verify the model output and the proposed action before moving forward, versus for a human on the loop or many loops, you can actually have that human monitor that situation much more holistically and think about, okay, what's going on at a broader level? For example, in the middle column where you've got a closed loop anesthesia system, ultimately you can have a human who's still checking that the person's vital signs appear appropriate, etc., but you don't need that human, that anesthesiologist actually there controlling the ventilator system settings, controlling the medication administration. They can take that bigger picture holistic view as they're monitoring what's taking place. And so finally here, in terms of future AI implementation, we are only at the tip of the iceberg. It is easiest to conceptualize how AI can replicate human tasks, but the more exciting part is how AI can augment medicine through beyond human tasks. And I'll actually say a key current area of innovation for which we're seeing a number of devices coming through is with multimodality and cross-modality learning. For example, training radiology devices based off pathology results, similar to what I was indicating with mammography earlier on. Essentially here, you've got the opportunity to essentially get what I describe as beyond human interpretations from radiology studies, and ultimately the opportunity to just glean much more from what you're already looking at. So 3 parting thoughts about how I see AI impacting medicine moving forward. Once again, we're at the tip of the iceberg. It is easiest to conceptualize how AI can replicate human tasks, but the more exciting part is how AI can augment medicine through beyond human tasks. The second is that Rome wasn't built in a day. AI will be gradually introduced for specific tasks, for example, triaging abnormal radiology cases, rather than arriving overnight. And finally, art versus science. And this was something that was emphasized to me during medical school, that medicine is an art, not a science. But I will actually say with AI, medicine will involve more consideration of probabilities and therefore more consideration of the scientific side. But the art will be in the key role for healthcare providers being in the interpretation of these probabilities for patients. So with that, thank you very much for listening to me. I'll say thank you as well for everybody who has been involved in this work, especially the team members in the Digital Clinical Research Organisation for all of their work over the past 5 years, as well as the broader team members within Mass General Brigham AI, very much including Kathy, the participating radiologists and other clinicians who we have involved in our studies as well, and also to the sponsors who have supported this research. Thank you.
Well, great talk, James, and thank you for elucidating the very complex world of the FDA for our listeners. That was a wonderful talk. I don't think we don't have time for questions. You're getting some kudos here. Great talk and useful talk and so on and so forth. So thank you very, very much. And I was smiling about that paper because I was going to ask you a question about the difference between European and US, and hopefully we can combine the best of both of those, because there are benefits to the US approach as well as the European, and I'd love to see the FDA evolve to some of the benefits of those. But wonderful
agreed,
talk.
agreed. And I will say, as you indicate, there are benefits for both systems where, yeah, agreed. It would be nice to take the benefits from both.
From both. Fantastic. Thank you. Wonderful examples, wonderful talk. Thank you so much. And everyone, we'll see you next month. Take care.